What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with another NFL draft video. Your team needs and game plan for the NFC North this 2022 NFL draft. The way that I would attack each team's top needs in this year's draft. If that sounds good, don't forget to spike the like button and subscribe for more BLV NFL content just like this, where I cover all 32 NFL teams. Let's waste no more time and get into the NFC North with the Chicago Bears. The Bears have a ton of needs on their roster. This is a team clearly going through a bit of a rebuild internally, as they are basically going through a regime change, which is causing a difference in scheme, a difference in personnel through that scheme, on top of trying to get out some of the contracts and some of the business that they've done over the past few seasons under the old regime. So the Chicago Bears, I believe, just need to look at the big positions. They need to look at the tackle position, the edge position, the wide receiver position, and the corner position. The Bears need to try to hit on the most important positions outside of quarterback. That is kind of where I feel they are at. Now, their biggest needs to me are the tackle position to protect Justin Fields, because Justin Fields is a quarterback that you want to see utilize his strengths, which is his mobility and his athleticism. So you need tackles that can protect him. You need tackles that can open up the run game. And I feel like their left or right side is in need of an upgrade. You know, Tevin Jenkins was a high priority pick a year ago in the second round. You still got Cody Whitehair at guard. Patrick Lewis was signed at center, but he's maybe a short-term solution there. But I really look at right tackle. They don't have an answer there currently. So I think right tackle is where they should go early in this draft. If it were me, if there's a good tackle on the board where they pick, that would be my pick. Now, following the tackle position, I think they should look at wide receiver. I think Darnell Mooney is great. I love him as a up-and-coming wide receiver. I'm not quite sure if he's going to be like a go-to number one throughout the rest of his career, but I think at least he's a high-end number two with a lot of downfield ability and speed, and perfectly matches what you want with Justin Fields. So I think that adding another guy there, replacing Allen Robinson, getting younger, building some rapport with Justin Fields would be very nice to see. There are a couple Ohio State guys in the first round that the Bears could look at and take to partner with Justin Fields. I don't view your receiver position having a clear number two whatsoever. I don't even think you have a number three. You know, maybe Byron Pringle is that guy, but I don't know. This is a severely lacking wide receiver talent type of team here. Running back, you're good. Tight end, I think you're fine for this year. We'll see how Cole Kmet continues to develop. Defensively, your edge position is not in immediate need, but you do not have an absolute stud for longevity, right? Robert Quinn was really good last year, but he's older. You brought in Muhammad, who's a solid starter in this league. Gibson, who's a nice rotation player. You've got some talent at that position, but nothing young and studly the way you had Khalil Mack in the past. You know, the interior defensive line could definitely use some work. They're going through a rebuild on that position, losing Akeem Hicks, losing Eddie Goldman, you know, Nichols as well. They've lost 3 or 4 players at that same position. And I understand that that position is not necessarily as important in this new scheme under Matt Eberflus, but they still need a big-time player at that spot. You know, you look at the Colts with DeForest Buckner, for example, there. Linebacker, I think you're fine. That is more of a luxury spot, especially when you have Roquan Smith already there. Cornerback, you've got Jalen Johnson, who's a number one, but, you know, you bring in Tavon Young, who's solid. I think he's actually underrated. Maybe you look for a number 2 corner deeper in the draft, second, third, fourth round range. Safety as well could use some work, but you bring in Cruikshank, I believe is how you pronounce his name, from Tennessee. Houston Carson is also on the roster to partner with Eddie Jackson, who could potentially be better in this system. I think you could use a safety, but again, that's more of like a luxury where you could look to add a vet to come in and play some starting snaps there throughout the rest of free agency, a post-draft type of move. But I think Chicago needs just difference makers. Tackle, wide receiver, pass rush, interior or edge, and then potentially corner. So really, when you're looking at this team, you're taking best player available at those spots. I think first round is most likely going to be spent on offensive line or receiver, and then the rest of the draft is going to follow suit with defense and potentially protecting Justin Fields, because this roster needs a lot of work, and it's going to take a couple years for that to happen, but this will be the start of it if you can find some foundational pieces at those most important positions. So that is the Chicago Bears and how I view their biggest needs. The Detroit Lions are up next. The Lions, I think, are actually in a better long-term spot right now than the Bears, despite not having their long-term solution at quarterback yet. I think that the Lions have a lot more youth at some big positions. I look at their offensive line being solid. Like, I don't even think they need to look at offensive line this year. They've got all 5 of their starters back, including a couple depth pieces like an Evan Brown, who's solid to work with as well. I love that they added DJ Chark in free agency to lessen the importance of drafting a wide receiver early, because I thought that wide receiver was going to be their biggest need coming into the draft. But with DJ Chark, St. Brown, and Josh Reynolds, and Khalif Raymond, and then even Cephas, you've got 4 or 5 players that can play in this league at wide receiver, and all offer something slightly different. So if DJ Chark delivers on his talent, he is a number 1 receiver or a high-end number 2. St. Brown functioned as sort of a high-end number 2 type last year and was the most productive receiver on their team last year. And we've seen Josh Reynolds be a good number 3 in this league. So I think the Lions don't necessarily need to add a first-round talent at wide receiver. They could look at that position at 32 if they like. But I think they're in a position where they're going to pick an edge, most likely, high in this draft at number 2 overall. And that's going to significantly help their defense to add a difference maker to their defensive line. I don't think they need to look much at interior D-line, as I don't think that's a huge, big position, a cornerstone position, so to speak. But they added a lot of players at that spot last year. Michael Brockers in free agency through trade. They added 2 players through the draft last year in the 2nd and 3rd round. So I don't think that's necessarily a huge priority. So I think edge to go with the Aquaras and Charles Harris would be huge at that 2nd overall spot. On top of that, maybe getting some speed and some difference-making ability at linebacker could be something you look at in the 2nd, 3rd round range. But I think cornerback is certainly a spot where you need to look, because Okudah, we're going to see how he develops. I like Mike Hughes. That pickup was excellent, in my opinion. So it's interesting. The Lions are really, really tricky, I think, because safety is also a need. Like, I see a multitude of needs here, but I've also seen them address these needs, and I'm not quite sure how they feel about some of these developmental players from the last couple of years that are going to be having to step up into these roles. Tracy Walker had a nice bounce back year last year. But, man, I think the Lions are going to go edge in the 1st round, maybe wide receiver late 1st round, maybe another difference maker on defense in the 1st round. I think wide receiver would be the only position on offense that they go with early in the draft. Then 2nd round, they've got an opportunity to go with maybe some secondary linebacker type players, maybe a safety, maybe a linebacker. That's where you start to get into some of the more luxury positions of potentially D-tackle, potentially safety, potentially linebacker, which are not as important as wide receiver, tackle, corner, right? So I think if I were the Lions, I'd go with that best player at number 2 that you love the most. Probably going to be D-end. Then you go wide receiver at the end of the first maybe, or just the best defensive player on the board, and then go from there. But I'd like to see them be able to address the linebacker spot. I'd like to be able to see them address safety as well. So those are all positions that I think the Lions can look at, but the Lions are going to set themselves up if they can have a nice draft here with a team that is set and ready for their next quarterback, because we know it's not going to be Jared Goff. He's kind of that bridge guy. Next year, they can look at that quarterback and then hit the ground running from there, because that's really what I'm looking at for the Lions. If they can hit a couple big players in this draft, especially in that first round, they can be working with something. So Detroit's set up pretty in this draft, and this is going to be a huge, huge turning point for this franchise if they can hit on these picks. That is my thoughts on the Lions. Next, we go with the Green Bay Packers. The Packers are a lot more obvious than the Bears and the Lions, as the Lions and the Bears need a lot more positions. The Packers are in win now mode. They're in Super Bowl window mode. They've got Aaron Rodgers back, and it's obvious what they need on their football team. When you look at their defense, they're good in the secondary. They don't need to address that. You look at their defensive line. Kenny Clark is there. They brought in Jerron Reed to help that out. So could they use some depth on the D-line? Sure, but that's not first, even second round priority. I'd look at that third, fourth round type of range, right? Linebacker, Devondre Campbell was a huge hit last year in free agency. They re-signed him. Barnes also isn't bad. So you've got your 1-2 at linebacker. Maybe depth later in the draft. Not a big deal though, right? Edge could be a position that's sneaky high priority for them, given that they lost to Darius Smith. But they do have Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith. So you're still good there, but maybe you're looking for the future at that spot. But I want to stress with the Packers that they should be looking more for the current, more for the now. And the now is the wide receiver position and the offensive line. I think they should be looking at wide receiver in the first round, if not twice in the first round. You should be going wide receiver, or wide receiver, offensive line, or wide receiver, offensive line, wide receiver. I mean, that is the type of draft they should be having this year, is helping out Aaron Rodgers on the offensive side of the football. They recently brought in Sammy Watkins to go along with Alan Lazard, Randall Cobb, Winfrey, Amari Rodgers. But all of these guys are depth receivers. I mean, these are threes at best on this roster. They need 1s and 2s. And at the very least, they need to spend 1 pick in the first round on a wide receiver, if not 2. The other pick could go to guard, potentially right guard to be exact, maybe even left guard, but like their guard positions could certainly use some work. So I could see them go with the guard late in the first round. I don't think that would be egregious. Second round, you could go with edge. You could go with wide receiver again. Or you could go, that's pretty much it, honestly. Maybe D-line. But like I said, I don't think they usually typically value that position. So I think it's going to be wide receiver, offensive line, wide receiver, maybe a tight end in the mix as well, defensive line, and depth at linebacker. And that's the Packers for you. The plan is obvious. Get weapons for Aaron Rodgers and protect Aaron Rodgers, and then everything else is gravy for me. That is my plan for the Packers. Let's move next to the Minnesota Vikings, the final team in the NFC North that I think has a better roster than a lot of people think. Just when they think of the Vikings, I think they think of them as an average team. But I'm actually looking at this roster, and have been for the last day, and I feel like this is a good team on paper. Kevin O'Connell, new head coach, going to be functioning a new system. Obviously, with new coaching staff comes new priority on players and differences in terms of how they feel about certain positions. And I think we look at the defensive side of the football first. I think cornerback is clearly a position of need in this system, as opposed to the Zimmer system where they never really truly spent a ton of capital on corner. This is more of a Vic Fangio style scheme, which means there's going to be more pressure on getting corners in the building. Now, they brought in Patrick Peterson and Chandon Sullivan out of free agency. Of course, Peterson was there last year, but they re-signed him. And Cameron Dantzler is also a guy that could potentially play on the outside too. So they don't have a terrible corner position, but they're really lacking an upper echelon corner, which I think is where they should be spending their first round pick. If not their first round pick, their second round pick. They've addressed the edge position. They've addressed the interior defensive line with Harrison Phillips. They've addressed the linebacker position with Jordan Hicks. So all those positions are addressed. You don't need to spend high capital on those positions in this draft. So corner is the clear and obvious pick here in the first round. You could possibly see a safety, but I think that's less important. So corner, safety, early in this draft. Wide receiver is good. You don't need to look there really. Offensive line, maybe you look at guard later in the draft for depth and maybe a developmental type of guy, but you did spend a third-round pick on Wyatt Davis, who might be ready this year to play more snaps. So we'll see about that. But overall, I view the Vikings as secondary. I mean, with this type of defense, that's the way you got to go. And that's, I think, the way they planned it. Let's get linebackers. Let's get front seven guys in free agency that we know can play in the system. And then let's attack the draft with some corners and some safeties. I think that's really where they're going to put their emphasis on. And then from there, they're going to look to add some depth to the D-line. They're going to look to add some depth to the O-line and try to beef this team up a little bit for 2022 and beyond. That is my thoughts on the NFC North, guys. That's my plan for the NFC North. Let me know in the comments how you feel. Was I right? Was I wrong? Let me know if you think that the team needs and the priority I put on those team needs is correct. Also, let me know how you would pick and who you would pick in this draft. It's Mitch. Thanks for watching. Gronk, spike the like button, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace!